Good morning. So, if you're following along, I am now on chapter 6 of Radical Acceptance, which is called The Radical Acceptance of Desire, Waking to the Sense of Longing. This actually is a great chapter, and I feel like, well, first I'll apologize because I'm a little nasally getting over a head cold, but I feel like this chapter, you could do a book club discussion on just this chapter. It's so good. She brings up so much that goes along with my study of both neurobiology, and I'm currently taking a class by Dan Siegel on interpersonal neurobiology. All of these things align really well in this chapter. So I'll try not to make this super long because I know that no one wants to do that. But if you are reading, this is a great chapter to reread. I really think there's so many good things in this chapter to remember, and I will try to summarize and bring them to all of you who are not reading along. So this goes to the Buddhist principle, which is often like one of the first things that people hear or are introduced to, which is basically the idea that life is suffering and craving and desires cause suffering. And when we first hear that, and Tara, makes a point of saying when she first heard that, she kind of dismissed the whole study of Buddhism because that felt like such a terrible thing. Like, who wants to live life without these wonderful desires, right? And I took another Coursera class that was called Buddhism and Modern Psychology, and he does a really great job of explaining this in detail. So if you're interested in more Buddhism stuff, there's a Coursera course from a guy, I think he's from Stanford or Princeton, I can't remember now. I think it's Princeton. And he talks about how cravings are suffering because they're short-lived, and we all know that. Like, if you have your favorite thing and the actual psychology and neurobiology of that is that we have this like desire, it lights up in our brain, and we start thinking about how and imagining how amazing it's going to be, and then we actually partake in it, and it's a very short-lived boost in our brain. And it's good because he talks about why it's necessary that we not have continual boost, right? Because we'd lose motivation to do everything. But Tara talks more about how pleasures and cravings can lead to fantasy, and that when we're kind of enveloped in these fantasies, that it's this wanting is really future focused. And remember, the whole point of radical acceptance and meditation and mindfulness is really being present in the present part of our world and not falling into reflecting and getting stuck in the past or in the future. So she goes on to talk about how we don't, I have copious notes. That's why I keep looking down. I'll try and move them. Don't fight the experience because you cannot escape it. And if you fight it, it is going to create more problems, right? And get you farther from where you want to be. And that life is really about relating to what you are experiencing, right? So you want to accept what you are experiencing and not get lost in what you're experiencing. So she goes on and she talks about wanting attention and how this can start from a very young age. She has some stories and illustrations of this, and that basically it is a human desire, right, to have attention and to be seen. I talk about this in my coaching practice, and that when we feel rejected, and it could be even not rejection that's like outright, just so you know, because a lot of times when I say that your kid just wants to be seen or you just want to be seen, you think the other person is rejecting that outright, like, I don't have time for you, or just not. But sometimes it's just that they can't give you the attention that you want and desire. And when that happens, we often get feelings of fear and shame, and we hide or shrink back. And this can create what is called, your self story, the story we tell ourselves over and over again. Things like, there's something wrong with me for wanting so much, or why can't I ever get what I want, or the world is so against me, I never get anything. And when this happens and we tell ourselves in this story, it gets perpetuated over and over again. And the more we tell ourselves this, the more we get sucked into self-judgment and obsessive thinking. And believe it or not, when you tell yourself that story, your wanting, your desires, and your wants grow stronger, right? So this leads to what Tara calls the reactivity cycle, which is really interesting if you study, like me, neurobiology, because this is a real thing that happens in your brain. When this cycle, and I'm going to just summarize what she says, it starts with a wanting, whether it's wanting attention or something else. There's a deep need, all right? And you want this need to be fulfilled. And then it's deprived for some reason, all right? It could be outwardly rejected. It could just not be given at the amount that you personally need. And this leads to you feeling like that's because you're unworthy, right? You're unworthy because this need didn't get met. And when you feel unworthy, your mind tries to cope. Okay? So if you're feeling unworthy and you're trying to cope, you start developing strategies. And each person is different, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those things. One of the strategies, if you are stuck in this cycle and this, you have this desire to be wanted, it's rejected for some reason, and now you're feeling unworthy, and so your way of coping is your mind says you need to impress others. So this can be knowledge or talent. You develop this need, right, to impress others in some way, shape, or form. I have done this myself. I'll be completely open and honest with you that my own coach often says to me, why do you feel the need to tell people, your academic background? Why is it important to you to like have these things by your name? Why do you search out and take class after class and get certification after certification, right? So it's interesting because that is like an internal want of me, right? Not being met and feeling unworthy. And my coping strategy my whole life has been to drive myself into obtaining and trying to get this knowledge or this certification, right? That would tell people that I'm worthy, right? So that is something that I can relate to. Can also be a drive for power or money. So the super driven people, right? They got rejected for some reason and have this desire and this wanting, and it's not getting fulfilled, that need. And so they ignore it, and they think by getting higher up in business or getting more powerful, somehow it's trying to fulfill that void, right? And that wanting grows stronger and stronger, and they become more and more money hungry, power hungry. You see this in the business world often. You also see this with people who are desperately pursuing sexual conquests, right? They've been rejected in their life in some way, shape, or form, and now it's, well, I'm going to fulfill it this way. I'm going to, and they feel that the sexual experience is going to make them feel better, and feel wanted. And it's often misplaced, or it becomes like continual, like I need more and more and more, and different and different and different, and more intense and more intense. You can also, and this is an interesting one because I feel like in our society, this is the most accepted one. You feel compelled to be of service to somebody else. In other words, you want to be needed by someone else. And so this desire that was unmet of being wanted, right? This wanting desire leads you to sometimes even a job or volunteering or the inability to say no, which we all have part of our personality that does that. And in some people that becomes their story. Like, I continually need to be, and you can see people get wrapped up and think that this is going to fulfill that need. Oftentimes it does not, but it's a story that they tell themselves, and it's a way that your brain is coping with being rejected and not really fulfilling that need. The other thing she talks about is the more immediate things. And some people in their mind, right, when they are rejected and in this reactivity cycle, they search out the more immediate kind of fulfilling things. And that's usually the pleasures of like food or alcohol or drugs, because these things provide an immediate gratification. Right? So there's some sort of immediate gratification. Oftentimes it's a sensation, right? That it is temporary, but it can feel really good, and it can numb over other things and cover that shame and fear that's like underneath of that, again, cycle that's happening inside. So the reason why all these things are important to be aware of is because they do not address the actual need. And she goes on to talk about that this cycle continues, right? This suffering, right, would continue. The cycle continues because we're constantly seeking to relieve that suffering. Our strategies to get what we want also become a defining part of our sense of self. And this is again where my worlds collide in this book, because when you study neurobiology, this is exactly what happens. You define yourself based on these strategies of actual coping that are probably from a long, long time ago. It's really interesting. I'm having a hard time not going into copious amounts of discussion about this. But if you want to talk about it further, chat me up or start a discussion below. These strategies become built into our sense of self. So oftentimes we just say, well, I'm an overeater. Now it's part of who I am. It's not something that I use as a strategy. It's actually part of who I am, right? I'm the overweight person. That's me. And an overeater. There are people who say, I'm just competitive. Like, that's just who I am. I'm just a competitive person. I'm just a people pleaser. That's just who I am. I need to be in service of others. Like, that's just part of who I am. But what is really interesting in this book is that Tara is saying that these things are actually like falsehoods of our sense of self, and that there is a unmet need that is underneath those things that we have learned to define ourselves as. It's big kind of feelings there. All feel the need. We are actually isolating ourselves from our authentic desires and our deepest longings for love and belonging. So it's almost like the brain wants to protect you from the rejection. And if you had any trauma, or you had repeated or early onset times where you felt rejected in this area, right, of love and belonging, the desire of wanting, oftentimes these become part of ourselves, and they really do isolate ourselves, because how can you, for example, I'll say me, how can I stop and become healthy and not a food abuser if I define myself as fat and an overeater? If that is how I picture myself, then the mind says, oh, that's the program I run. Oh, you're an overeater? Then when things get stressful, or when you feel that need or rejection or shame or guilt, that's what I'm going to go to. So it's almost impossible, until you recognize that you're doing it, to get out of that cycle. That's just a repetitive, reactive cycle that goes over and over and over. Oh, it's so big, and it makes me want to reach out to people, because I feel like you could take this chapter and work on this for longer than a week. The previous chapters, I have said, were like pieces of practice towards radical acceptance that I think you could do in a week. If you followed along, you have a weekly challenge. You'll have a weekly challenge this week, but I really implore you to dig down deep. This is part of your personal growth, this chapter, and I feel like you could spend a lot of time on it. And if you find yourself defining yourself or often stuck in this reactive cycle, I encourage you to find support, whether that's a friend or a therapist or a coach, to reach out for that, to dig deeper, because it's not easy work. It's really hard work, especially if you're middle-aged and have been doing this for 30, 40, 50 years. It's really hard to get out of that cycle of reactivity. Fear not, she tells us how to do it. She says, she also has like a little warning in there and says, just be aware that your own work can become this substitute, and this substitute of unworthiness, and it is not our unmet need, right? But we're kind of substituting with work. So I was saying that feeling of needing to be in service of others, sometimes we get sucked up in that our work, because we're needed, or we're making money. And it's easy to feel good and ignore the unmet need underneath. So really becoming aware, which is what she has said right at the very beginning and built into this book, is really important. All right. So she talks about the fixes, the have to have, I have to have this right now, can be irresistible. If you've talked to anyone with an addiction, I talk about this with sugar. I can dream about sugar and cakes. It feels irresistible to me at times if I'm in super stress mode. And then here's the feedback loop. It's irresistible because my mind has already defined that this is what I do, right? I have this unmet need that I'm ignoring completely. I feel rejection. I engage to get the temporary fix, right? Which feels good at the moment. But that temporary fix goes away, and then I feel shame and guilt, which cycles back to, how do I get out of feeling rejected in shame and guilt? Well, I need the fix. So this is a cycle that can continue and continue and continue. You've seen it in every Hallmark movie, right? Like, why do people, when you say, why do they do this to themselves? That is the brain trying to protect itself. It is really interesting when you look at the psychology of it. But it is natural that the brain would want to do it. It's running the program that you gave it. And until we break that cycle, it will just continue. All right. There's also this feeling, P.S., the cycle continues, because when we see a glimpse of that cycle, oftentimes we then hate ourselves for being stuck in that cycle. And instead of stopping the cycle, we engage in behavior that's self-judgment And that self-hatred continues the cycle because we end up condemning ourselves. We end up injuring ourselves in the body or the mind. We talk awful self-talk to ourselves. Some people, physically do things to their bodies. And this just continues the cycle. It does not meet the unmet need. It continues us into this reactivity, really. She moves on in this chapter. I could, again, spend a lifetime talking about that. I will refrain. If you want to talk more about that or listen to me talk more about that, I can do a whole separate talk on that. Why that happens, how we need to put out lifelines, how we recognize it in ourselves. She goes on and she talks about awakening versus desire. And she talks about the loophole where a lot of people looking to better themselves or do spiritual enlightenment, and whether that's on the Buddhist path or any other spiritual path, oftentimes they are mistaken in the fact that they think that when they've reached enlightenment, right, or a spiritual awareness, that means you shut off things and you don't desire anymore. So she tells a great story. Again, she litters this book with stories, so there's some really great stories. She talks about a woman who built a little hut for a monk in the back, and after months and months of taking care of this monk, she decides to do this little test, and she sends this gorgeous, beautiful young woman to bring in breakfast. She asks her to hug him and give it to him and then report back what happened. And the woman comes back and says he was literally frozen and had no reaction. And she went into the monk and she said, how did you feel when that happened? And he was like, I felt like a withering tree of nothingness. I didn't feel anything. And the woman kicks him out and says, you're not who I thought you were. I've wasted all these months on thinking you were this spiritually aware person, and you are not. Because she says, instead of appreciating this girl's youth and loveliness, instead of noting your natural sexual attraction and response and allowing it to pass without acting on it, you shut down. And this is not enlightenment. In other words, desires continually happen. It is natural. No one doesn't feel. It doesn't matter how close to God you are, how close to the universe, how close to enlightenment. You will always feel desires. That's part of being human. And the enlightenment part, the spiritual awareness part, comes from being in a place where you recognize the desire, you are aware and allow those feelings to exist, not act on them, because all things will pass. This too shall pass. And allow that to happen. You don't shut down. You don't ignore, because that's not really being in tune with who you are or the fact that you're a human. So I love that story so much. She goes on and talks about how continued desire is not a sign that you are trapped in the lower impulses. That's a very big enlightenment thing in Buddhism, right? That the lower impulses, mean you're not on the path to enlightenment. And people get stuck in thinking that means that I'm not going to experience desire or a want. And that's not the case. She also says there's a big pitfall here that people think that when you are higher up in your enlightenment path, that you don't need comfort or help from others and that it's a weakness. And she says that is absolutely not the case. In fact, she says this, I wrote this down because I loved it so much. We harden against life by disconnecting from our tenderness. When we reject desire, we reject the very source of love and aliveness. Oh, I love that so much. So again, with the whole philosophy of radical acceptance, we can't just ignore these things. We can't, harden ourselves or our hearts and try not to feel things. We have to feel and accept things fully. Love that. All right. Then she moves on to a section that I don't know if she calls it this because I'm listening to the audiobook and not reading the physical book. She says, "Not my fault." And basically, she's following a person who is an overeater, and tells her story and is kind of explaining things through her story. And what she had found is she had tried different things to overcome overeating and basically found that they were not working. So Tara says, "I want you to experience everything that arises. And as it arises, I want you just to say to yourself this too. And I'm feeling this too. And this too." And she has a whole practice of meditation and a whole session in her therapy with this woman that she allows her to just keep adding to what she's experiencing, and this too. And she basically goes on and says, what we learn from this too, and is that things are ephemeral, right? Like, it's ever changing in the landscape of our mind and our body. And if we learn to accept and be aware and then allow it to pass with compassion, we can break that cycle that we have been in for so long, right? That cycle of reactivity means if we can accept ourselves without judgment, right? Without having that terrible part where we berate ourselves, you stop the shame, right? So you're going to break. So remember, I talked about this cycle. You're here. If you break the self-judgment and the shame, you just kind of allow yourself, you stop the reactivity, or sometimes you even have to, experience the reactivity and the coping mechanism that you've used for so long. But if you can stop yourself from the shame part and the self-judgment, it stops that feedback loop. So you've actually stopped that reactivity cycle, which reinforces all those bad habits, right? You don't act, you move on, you use the things she's talked about, those pausing, those awareness exercises, and you break this cycle. And ultimately, you end up forgiving yourself and being present. Now, I think I could talk forever about forgiveness and my personal growth. That's one of the hardest things, is self-compassion and self-forgiveness for me. So it's one of those things that I could probably, again, do a whole session on. So instead, I will leave it at that. Tara says, you want to be in a place where you're neither grasping for something, desperately grasping for something, nor resisting like the monk. You want to be present and accepting of whatever is happening and realizing that everything in this life is changing. It does not stay the same. We need to get out of that mindset of it's always going to be this way, right? I'm never going to do this thing. We need to get out of those words. So here is your weekly challenge. I'm going to give you the little guided thing she's asking you to do challenge, and then I will put the meditation in the comments that she has. So here's your weekly challenge. Find an area that you are compelled to by your wanting mind. And again, this is very personal, whether that's computers or working or exercising or eating or drinking, whatever, become aware of something that you always feel compelled to do. Okay. And be honest with yourself. You don't have to tell anyone else. This is your own personal growth journey. When that arises, that want and that desire to do that thing arises, we are going to pause. Remember your sacred pause? Well, before you were doing it on purpose, now, right, in a random place, that habit, now you're going to use those same strengths and you're going to pause before you act in whatever was compelling you. You're going to be physically still. So you're going to take that deep breath and you're going to calm your body, right? And you're going to say these things to yourself. First, what does my body feel like? So when this desire, when this wanting is really strong, what does my body feel like? And where specifically am I feeling that want, that sensation of wanting? Is it butterflies in my stomach? Is it agitation in my chest? Is it aching in my arms? Like I really need to do this thing, right? And pay attention to your mind. Is your mind racing and speeding up? Is it slowing down and getting stuck in this kind of slow thing? Do you feel like you're being pulled forward or kind of stuck in the same place? Then notice if this changes during the pause. May or may not for you, but notice if that same intensity of butterflies is the same during your pause. The same aching, the same squeezing of the chest. Your mind thoughts. Do they continue and continue and continue? Do you see some spacing? Do they go to something else? Just notice that. Again, this is her awareness. So you're using pause and awareness, which she has shown you before in previous chapters. And then ask yourself, what is missing right now? All right? Listen to your heart. Use that pause. This is a little bit of mindfulness to say to yourself, okay, I'm noticing this. I'm noticing this feeling. My mind keeps playing this out over and over and over again. Is anything changing? Is it all staying the same? And then say to yourself, what am I missing? Like, what is underneath this super want and desire? All right. If after all of this, you still move on and into the behavior, which we're not judging, right? Do so slowly and mindfully. Pay attention to all the little things. You know, like if you're eating, take the time to sit down and do so mindfully. Slow down your bites. Slow down how much you put in and all of those things. You're going to be mindful of this now compulsive thing that you needed to do out of your wanting self, okay? And notice, do you feel tension or excitement? Are there thoughts of self-judging or fear or shame? Notice everything that arises. This is part of being mindful, right? So I now paused before. I took note of everything that was happening. I am now engaging in that behavior. I'm still going to eat, right? Like nothing has changed. I'm going to eat. And now I'm going to do this eating mindfully, right? So I'm slowing everything down. I'm paying attention to everything. And I'm going to notice the sensations in my body, the emotions, and the thoughts that are running through my head, okay? Because this is the awareness. This is, I paused, I'm mindful, and now I'm fully aware of everything that's happening in the mind and body at this time. This is a great practice. Like I said, I know this, I've been doing these as weekly challenges. I would love this to be more than a weekly challenge. And if you're stuck in that cycle or have a really intense cycle of reactivity, this is something that you could do definitely more than a week. And the key to this is not judging yourself, right, for the behavior that you're doing. That you're not judging yourself for giving in to the want. All right. Observing desire without acting on it enlarges our freedom to choose how we live. I'm going to say that one more time. If we can eventually observe our desire without acting on it, and you can think of the monk story, it enlarges our freedom to choose how we live. That's the key. And that is what we move towards in this exercise. Because we have to realize that these desires will occur, that we have to then say to ourselves and have an awareness that things are ephemeral. They change. They will pass. And if you can join those two things, recognizing and accepting your desire, having the awareness that it will change, you will notice that the intensity, the cravings, the compulsion for these things, the intensity will start to fade over time if you can engage in this practice. She says that being mindful of what occurs during and after can allow us, again, the ability to consciously choose instead of falling into the cycle. Actually, she didn't say that. I wrote that. But I think that's what she's getting at, right? Is that if we can be mindful that it's there, we know that it will pass. We also then have accepted everything that happens during the cycle. So that's why it's important to not stop yourself from the cycle, but be mindful during the cycle. Because I'm going to go to the professor of that course that I mentioned in the beginning, which is Buddhism and Modern Psychology. He makes a great little story about sugar donuts. Powdered donuts are like his favorite thing, you know, and he might have these huge cravings. He doesn't, you know, eat them all the time, but if he gets the craving, like it builds up in his mind as this is going to be the greatest thing ever. Oh my gosh, my mouth is watering just thinking about them. And I'm going to feel so good. And then what happens is you eat them and you may get that instantaneous, temporary, right, release of pleasure sensations, fades really quickly. And then sometimes I don't feel so great afterwards. I wasn't satiated for a long time, or I'm still hungry afterwards, whatever it might be. And when that happens, we can kind of, if we're mindful, like plug that into our awareness so that the next time that desire comes up, we realize, why am I having that desire first, right? So again, mindfulness. Why am I having that desire? What's the unmet need that's really happening under there? Is this going to fulfill that? If I choose to do that, what's going to happen, right? And then I consciously can make that choice as opposed to feeling so swept up in that intense reactivity cycle. So it's so important. This chapter, honestly, is like your key to personal growth. Like as a coach, I look at this chapter and I think there are so many portions of this that I use in coaching that it almost feels like she succinctly put into one chapter, and it's really interesting. I love so much about this chapter. She also has a guided reflection about discovering your deepest longing. I will put a link to her guided meditation down there. Again, I would love your thoughts about this whole summary of radical acceptance, if it's helpful, if it's too short, if it's too long, if you hate the format, if you would rather have it as a book club. Any of those thoughts would be much appreciated. If you want me to continue and do a different one after radical acceptance, or you have, different thoughts about that, please post below or message me personally. Any of those things are acceptable. I hope you guys have a fantastic week. It's certainly chilly here. The other thing I would say is it is the season of thankfulness and gratitude. So I am so grateful that I am able to do these lives, connect with some people, more than just my coaching clients, although maybe it's just my coaching clients watching this, who knows, but I love them dearly too, and I'm so grateful for them and for them allowing me to be part of their journey. I hope that you have things that you are grateful for, and maybe remember one of those things or say it out loud to yourself today. So have a great week, and I'll see you next week.